economics in United States foreign policy. And our speaker, as you know, is a veteran of 30-some years in the State Department, number 3 position now being held by him. Mr. Donnelly, Shaun Donnelly, holds the rank of ambassador, having been our ambassador to Sri Lanka. Very quickly, it's a wonderful background. For reasons you'll never understand, I'll note that he went to the Culver Military Academy for his secondary school prep work, and Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin, BA in economics, 2 years in the Peace Corps in Tunisia, and then a Master of Arts degree in economics from Northwestern, a strong Midwestern background, obviously. His 32 years or so in the State Department, starting in 1972, is marked by a series of overseas assignments, and I should say that he specialized in economics and commercial affairs throughout his career. He's been posted in Senegal and in Tunisia and Egypt and Ethiopia, served as our Deputy Chief of Mission in Mali, and then also later in Tunisia as well, and as I indicated, was our ambassador to Sri Lanka. His general experiences in the State Department underline the breadth of experience and expertise that he brings to this evening's program. He has been Director of Development Finance at the State Department. He was an Assistant Secretary of State for with responsibilities for energy and sanctions and commodities, and during that same period of time served as a U.S. representative on the voting board of the International Energy Agency, and chaired one of their largest committees, the one on long-term cooperation. He also was an Assistant Secretary of State with responsibilities for trade, and he's been also had responsibilities in several other areas as well. The last position before his current one was as a special advisor for economic agricultural biotechnology. At present, as you know, he's a Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. He's responsible for the State Department's range of international trade policies and for the programs that are associated with it. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Ambassador Shaun Donnelly.
Thank you very much. Nice Midwestern introduction. I think you have a background there as well. I'm also a fellow Marylander. I live down in Silver Spring, so I'm sure that maybe some of my neighbors actually make it up here. Okay, great. When I joined the State Department back in 1972, economics and all these issues that I've spent a career working on really were not at the center. We were in a Cold War. In fact, the year I joined, 1972, was the first year of a State Department decided that its diplomats needed to be specialists. Until that day, we were all just Foreign Service officers, and you'd go from being the administrative officer in Moscow, and then you'd go sent to be commercial attaché in Lima, and then you'd go to Mexico City to be the environment officer. And it dawned on some people that the world was getting too complex, and we really needed to have people have a career focused on one of these specialties. So it actually, my generation of officers is really the first ones that people were recruited and came in and had a career either specializing in management, sort of keeping the embassies running and so on, or political issues, or United Nations issues, or international environment. My background academically was in economics, and that's what I was interested in, and I've been fortunate to have a career that has focused on those things. What I thought I would try to do tonight was to just give you a sense of what the agenda is in the economic area. And as I say, 30 years ago, the State Department wasn't doing a lot in the economic area. It was in the early 60s, in fact, that trade policy, one of the issues I've spent a lot of time on recently, was taken out of the State Department by President Kennedy and set up an independent office. It was called the Special Trade Representative's Office, and then it's evolved into what's called the United States Trade Representative's Office as an independent office of the President, because I think rumor or anecdotes say that it was President Kennedy's father, Joseph Kennedy, who felt that you couldn't trust the State Department, that we were the diplomats and we were going to try to be too friendly to foreigners, and we'd trade off, well, let's give them more access to our market, and in return they'll give us a vote at the United Nations or something. So there's been a sense that the State Department couldn't really be trusted on a lot of economic issues, and I'm happy to tell you that if that ever was true, it certainly is not true anymore. We have a very broad agenda, and I'd like to just give you a sense of what's there, and then maybe in the question and answer we can talk in detail about the questions that might be of greatest interest. We really have three pillars in our international economic policy that the State Department is working on. The first one is what we call economic security. And there are several important aspects of that. One of the ones that has really, frankly, since 9/11 emerged to the very top is trying to, two issues really in the counterterrorism side that we work on. One is terrorist finance. One of the lessons we learned out of 9/11 was that the terrorists involved in that operation and some others had been able to use some of the vulnerabilities and, frankly, some of the openness and access of the international financial system to move money around and so on. And so that was identified as a weakness. There were a lot of other people in various agencies, including the State Department, that were out there working on all the other important aspects of countering terrorism. We focused, along with our colleagues at the Treasury Department, on trying to find that right balance between blocking the use of legitimate financial institutions by terrorists, but without shutting them down. I mean, if we sort of you had to find that right balance between keeping the financial system open and flexible for legitimate business and so on, but at the same time making it difficult for those. And working with the United Nations and some of our friends bilaterally, some of our European partners very intensively, we've been able to identify lists of individuals and so-called charities and organizations that are terrorist, and we get them certified and put on a United Nations list, and then everybody tightens and restricts their ability to operate and to use the financial system. That's really very important. Another aspect that fell to us to really work on was the whole transportation security aspect. Again, the State Department's not doing it alone. We're working with the redesigned and reconfigured Department of Homeland Security. But all of these aspects related to cargo and people that come on airplanes, that come on ships, what kinds of, how could you control, what do we need to inspect every truck that goes back and forth across the Canadian border? I mean, and again, how do you find that correct balance between our security concerns and yet also our economic competitiveness and creating jobs and so on like this? If you get 100% security on the Canadian border, but it's at the expense of stopping every truck and delaying it for 3 days so it can be gone through, the economic cost that we and our workers and our companies are bearing in this globally competitive world is really too high. So how do you use new technology? How are you able to target, using intelligence and technology, target the real risks there in transportation security, in those coming by air, those coming by sea? Some of our colleagues on other sides of the State Department have been doing a lot of work, and you may have heard about this recently in the last couple of days, technology and passports and so on like this. How can we, these so-called biometric passports and some of the things that go with that, others are working on. But in this whole area of making sure that we're finding the best balance we can in the security and facilitating legitimate commerce and legitimate travel and so on like this. And I would like to say to you, we've gotten it absolutely perfect, but I can't. We've worked really hard on it. I think we've made a lot of progress. My random sample is sort of my own trips, and the amount of time I spend waiting at BWI or Reagan National or Dulles Airport tends to get a little bit less. I think we're getting the systems a little bit better. But think of all those containers, for example. I mean, that's we as individuals travel on airplanes mainly. but all those just, you see them everywhere around the world. The ubiquitous kind of container of it is really the vehicle through which so much of international commerce is moved and stuff like that. And how can we assure security there? Again, the State Department, our embassies overseas have been working with our colleagues from the Homeland Security, which includes now the Customs Department, to try and, again, we put people overseas who can work with the local customs people if we can inspect random or targeted containers overseas, push that checking out further away from our borders where we're better able to do it. And this is something we've done initially with the 20 largest ports in the world, Container Security Initiative, CSI, not the CSI we all watch on television. But that's another area that, again, the State Department is not doing this alone. We're working with one of our domestic partner agencies, in this case, Department of Homeland Security, the customs people. But we are working to make sure that our embassies overseas and that our message is getting out of what we're trying to do. We're listening to maybe our ambassador someplace overseas is hearing a complaint from a businessman that this isn't working, this is a problem we're having. Sometimes our embassies are the bearers of news that people don't necessarily want to hear back here in Washington, but that's one of the functions, is to go out and explain what our policy is and get the feedback and try to help fine-tune those things. Another thing that's very important in this general first pillar that we talk about of economic security is our energy security. All of us realize how dependent we are on foreign oil. I mean, when I joined the Foreign Service in 1972, we were an oil exporter. We basically set the world price. Now we're dependent on foreign oil for about 60% of our consumption, and it's not going to change anytime soon. I mean, there's a lot of things we can do domestically, and the President has some ideas in his energy bill proposal. But I think there's a lot we can do internationally. We try, through our embassies, through the State Department, to work with American companies to try to help them go out and develop energy resources, oil and natural gas predominantly, other places in the world. If we can develop more in the Caucasus area, if we can develop more in Latin America that's outside of the Middle East, that's maybe a little closer to us geographically, and a lot of that is just hard work day by day of identifying a problem. An American company is interested in investing in Venezuela or in Azerbaijan or in Thailand or something, but they've got these problems, and different parts of our government try to help them, but the State Department, in particular our embassies overseas, spend a lot of time doing that. Next month in May, we'll see the inauguration of what's called the Baku-Ceyhan pipeline out of Georgia and Azerbaijan that will be through to Turkey, that will enable us to bring a lot of oil out of that area, which of Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, which are major underdeveloped resources in terms of oil. And it's not going to solve the shortage. It's not going to mean the prices come down. But it's really important for us, for each of us as individual citizens, that we are doing everything we can to do that. Now, there's a lot of other things going on of alternative technologies and hydrogen and all that may be more of a solution for our children and grandchildren. But for most of us in this room, I think we're going to live in a petroleum-dependent world, and the resources are limited, but the U.S. has got to work with our partners overseas, and our embassies and the State Department are doing a lot in that area. We also count in this economic security area the importance of sort of helping really key countries around the world to develop economically. I mean, at the top of the list, of course, would be Iraq and Afghanistan, but there are also I'm thinking of countries like Turkey and Egypt and Argentina. Some of these have been through financial crises in recent years. Some of them are facing political challenges. Maybe they're not perfect democracies. Maybe there's something. But we really have a stake, and not just an economic stake, in these countries succeeding. We have a vital interest in it. And I think maybe in the old days there was a tendency to think, well, that was a political problem. We have to build a political relationship with Turkey or Egypt. And I think one of the messages of this global economy that we live in now is that the economics and the politics blend together. And so we've got to be working to find ways to deal with debt problems, to deal with trade problems, to encourage communications development and transportation and all these things in these countries. I mean, Iraq is obviously at the top of the list, and I know there's a lot of controversy around Iraq, and there's certainly a lot of challenges remaining. And the focus, of course, when you turn on the television, is always about the security issues, the political issues, and so on like that. But we have, over the last year, really made a lot of progress on the economic side. We've gotten an Iraqi central bank up and running. We've gotten Iraq accepted as an observer with a path. It's not going to happen quickly toward full membership in the World Trade Organization, used to be called the GATT in Geneva. We've got them talking with the International Monetary Fund about an agreement of over $400 million of support that the IMF could provide to help them make some structural changes in their economy. The U.S. has taken a very aggressive lead in a group called the Paris Club. This is an international group of the major creditor nations, Europe, Japan, Australia, Russia's now a member, where we deal with debt problems around the world. And we've reached an agreement there, and it took a lot of hard negotiating from the U.S. side to get an 80% write-off in Iraqi debt. And a lot of this was bad debt that was accumulated under the Saddam Hussein regime, and to let this new government, with all the other problems they're facing, not be burdened by a lot of bad debts that they'd inherited. And now we're spending a fair amount of time going around to some of the countries that are not in the Paris Club, particular countries like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and some of those other countries, trying to get them to also step up to the plate and help their Arab brothers have a good financial basis on which to move forward. That's just an example. We worked a lot on Argentina's financial crisis. At one point, it's been up and down, and that's a very important country in an area that's very important to us. And I could talk about that at some point later. That's broadly defined the what I would call the economic security pillar. The second pillar is what I would call trade and investment. And this is basically, frankly, focused very much on trying to help the U.S. economy. This is trying to help American companies do better and American consumers do better by having more opportunity to greater access of goods and services available to us. And this is both a policy of trying to go out and create opportunities around the world to lower trade barriers, to open investment opportunities, and then to make sure that our partners are living up to the agreements that they make with us. We want to level the playing field. I mean, there's a lot of, you probably read in the paper, this big dispute we're having with our European friends in the European Union about the competition between Boeing and Airbus airplanes. We think the Europeans have, for about the last 15 years, been been subsidizing massive subsidies to help this Airbus consortium create and launch new aircraft. And we decided that wasn't appropriate. We've canceled this agreement we had with the Europeans on this. We're each threatening to take the other to the WTO, which is sort of this court of trade things. We think they're doing some things unfair. They think we are. But I think what you've seen is this administration, President Bush, Bob Zoellick, who has been the U.S. trade representative, who leads all of this, has now left that job and come over to the State Department, where he's now Secretary Rice's right-hand person, the Deputy Secretary of State. But when I started in the Foreign Service, again, 30 years ago, I think the calculation people always talked was that sort of an index of how international our economy was, that the total of all the goods we exported, goods and services that we exported, all the things we imported, and then the profits that went back and forth from investment that our companies had abroad and foreign companies had here, was about 10% of our economy. That was one of the lowest numbers in the world. Countries like Belgium and the Netherlands and Italy had very high numbers. They were, we're big, we're a continent, and we're more self-sufficient than a lot of other countries. But that was just an index, I think, of how international we were. Now the figure is over 30%. And still, there are a lot of countries where it's higher, but I think that shows how our economy is really much more integrated. A lot of controversy about trade, free trade, fair trade, trade liberalization. I'd like maybe at the end to talk a little bit about that because that's what I work on most days pretty intensively. But I would argue that creating opportunities also creates competition. Is that tough for businesses, U.S. businesses, foreign businesses? Yes, it is. Is it good for consumers that we have a range of opportunities? Yeah, I think it is. Is it a challenge? Is it hard for our companies to go off and take advantage of these opportunities in China or Nigeria or Nepal or Sri Lanka? Yeah. But 95% of the consumers in the world are outside of the U.S. The U.S., we've been doing pretty well recently. We've been growing about 3% a year. Our friends in Japan, our economy's been growing. Our friends in Japan and Europe are very jealous of that. But the real growth in the world is coming in places like China and India and the ASEAN nations of Southeast Asia, Korea. These are countries that on a sustained basis recently have been growing in the 5 to 8 to 10% range. And some of those are big markets and are growing. Some of them are smaller and are growing. But, I mean, that's where a lot of the future jobs and opportunities for us and our companies are going to be. On China, just to say a word, it's huge. I mean, that's one. My own personal view is 100 years from now, when people are writing the history of this time that we're living in, this is going to be the issue that they're going to talk about, is the emergence of China economically, politically, integrating into the world. I mean, I'm not a China expert, but I recall as a young diplomat in the early 70s in Africa, the Chinese, only spoke, embassy was where they had an embassy, it was small, they all wore Mao suits, they didn't talk to anybody, they were isolated from the world, they weren't in the United Nations. And now, I mean, China is a huge competitor for us economically, but they're also a huge partner for us in a lot of things we're trying to do in the world, starting with, say, North Korea, where we're trying to deal with some very challenging issues and so on. So I think, are there economic issues we have with China? You bet there are. We're running a huge trade deficit with China. We're concerned about the way China has locked its currency value to ours, and it hasn't gone up and down by the market the way we think currencies ought to. There have been some proposals in the Congress and from some in the business community of, by God, how we ought to be hitting China about this. The administration has had an approach of focusing on a somewhat quieter but very focused diplomatic approach that I think has a better chance of seeing progress. But that's a delicate but challenging issue. One area I just wanted to highlight in the trade area briefly is what we call intellectual property rights. That's this collection of copyrights and patents and trademarks and so on. This has been around. I mean, we had a copyright office, back when our country was formed, and a patent office, and I think Benjamin Franklin was a U.S. patent official at one point, and other people have been. This is not a new issue, but it has cosmic importance for us. I mean, the future of the U.S. economy is locked up in things that involve knowledge and high value added. It involves computer software, it's high-tech inventions, it's entertainment products, movies and music and games and discs. It's a lot of high-value brands of various kinds of products, and all of that rests on a system that respects intellectual property rights. And that's something we've been working on for a long time, there are huge problems in places like China and Russia and Brazil and other places in Latin America, but also, frankly, with some of our developed country partners, we have some differences there. But we're trying to work very aggressively to help these countries write the right kind of laws, help them enforce it, build their capacity to do that, try to get other countries to join with us so this isn't a lonely U.S. crusade. Just to say a word about corruption, it's a huge issue. For many years, it was an issue we couldn't talk about. It still remains sensitive in a lot of foreign countries, but the U.S. has been working very aggressively for the last, say, 10 years, trying to build international codes to fight corruption. I mean, we've had what's called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the United States that imposes very heavy penalties on U.S. companies that do anything improper overseas, bribing officials or other kinds of things. Frankly, a lot of our developed country partners haven't had those rules until a couple years ago, and many of them, some of our major European partners, it was a tax deduction if you had to bribe a foreign official. We've gotten an international agreement at what's called the OECD in Paris that that's not appropriate. Now we're pressuring people to enforce it. And, you know, some of our best friends, frankly, are laggards in doing that. But it's the right thing to do morally. It's the right thing to do as we go out and sell a private enterprise-based economic and political system. We have to be able to show developing countries that it can work and it's not going to be abused and so on. Part of that is how we enforce our own rules. Part of it is trying to help others do the same and challenge others to do that. It's really a very important effort. The third pillar, as I say, trade and investment we do because it's good for us. It creates jobs, it's good for the American economy, and so on. The third pillar is what we call sustainable development, and in the immediate focus, that's more because that's helping other countries, the poorer countries in the world. I mean, for me, personally, I think part of this is a moral issue. I think people who are better off, whether we're individuals in a community or countries in a community of nations, should share and help others that have been less fortunate. It's also, very frankly, not just an altruistic thing. I mean, if we can help the developing world, Africa and Latin America and Asia, to develop, they become better partners for us. They are going to buy more products for us. They're going to be more stable regions. There's going to be less war and revolution and turmoil and so on like this. Over time, I think the pattern is clear. It's not a one-to-one linear relationship, but countries that are growing more economically, that are a more competitive free enterprise economic system, do tend to develop more politically and human rights and democracy. I mean, I can think of examples from Philippines and South Korea and Mexico and others where I think the economic development did help create part of the context which helped the political development. So we think that the U.S. and other more developed countries stepping forward and helping the poorer countries in the world to develop is in our interest. We're doing that in a lot of ways. A lot of it is through the World Bank. We just have a new president, Mr. Wolfowitz has been elected and will take over there. It was a unanimous decision in the bank board, but I know there's some controversy about that. But the bank is a very important part of the U.S. Effort, and I think it's done a lot of good work. I think there's a lot more that it can do. The International Monetary Fund. The U.S. has taken the lead in the G8 on a very important initiative we call the Broader Middle East Initiative. This is an economic development, investment, but also education, treatment of women, and so on. And it is the Middle East, but the broader part is Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran that are technically not Arab League or perhaps Middle Eastern kinds of countries. But the BMINA is a very important effort we're working on. One of the, I know foreign assistance, foreign aid is a much debated and not the most popular program or topic in a lot of U.S. audiences. I think organizations like yours tend to attract people who have an understanding of it. I don't want to get into a long discussion of it, but I think one of the exciting new things that the administration has done is the creation of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the Millennium Challenge Act, which is a whole new way of doing foreign assistance. I'd be glad to talk more about it in the questions and answers, but we're basically making it performance-based. We're choosing the countries not on the basis of their political importance, not frankly on the basis of their poverty, but on the basis of their policies, their democratic policies, their political policies in terms of democracy, their economic policies in terms of being sustainable and so that the money will be well used, countries that invest in their people through education and basic health. And it's an exciting new program. Secretary Rice will be signing the first. It's called Compact under this new program. It's totally separate from the USAID program with Madagascar this week, and then we've got 3 or 4 others, Nicaragua, Cape Verde, Honduras, and Georgia that are in the pipeline, and we're doing that. The MCA has, in large part due to the Millennium Challenge account, but also some other things, U.S., what's called official development assistance, our foreign aid money, which in year 2000 was about $10 billion, is now, in 2004, went up to $19 billion. This is the steepest rise that we've seen really since the Marshall Plan in post-World War II. It's not easy. These are not the most popular programs in the Congress or parts of the American public, but I think we've been able to show, particularly with this exciting new MCC program, that we can do good things, use the money well, and get real results. We will see how that goes forward. Let me just talk a little bit more, maybe 3-4 minutes about trade, because that's what I've worked on most intensively. As I said from earlier, the U.S. is not the most trade-dependent country in the world. We have a big continent. We've got a wide range of resources and people and so on. But the advantage to us from trade, I mean, you can go back to the Adam Smith or David Ricardo models that some of us studied in economics in college and so on, and being able to use those products of comparative advantage are really powerful forces for promoting America's economic interest and the world's interest. Frankly, in the last half of the 90s, the Clinton administration had lost the ability or the authority from the Congress to negotiate trade agreements. Some of you who are constitutional or historians may remember that international trade was one of the aspects that the Congress kept for itself when it wrote the Constitution. This was, these were the original colonies, and they didn't want to give too much power to the federal authorities emerging. And so we as an administration, it's really, we need to work with the Congress. We need to get the authority. It's traditionally been called fast-track authority. More recently, we now call it trade promotion authority. And I think the administration, the Clinton administration, lost that. It ran out in, I think, 1995, and it was not able to be renewed. And that really, in a practical sense, stopped us from going out and negotiating new trade agreements. Because what foreign government's going to negotiate with the American government, the negotiators, and then have the agreement go up to the Congress, and each individual committee can rewrite this and change the tariff to protect their particular state or something like that. So what we've traditionally done, going back to the 60s, is get this sort of fast-track authority where the administration commits that they will do trade agreements based on the following principles. These are the objectives. They commit to consulting with the Congress, and then in return, the administration can go off and negotiate them, and then come up to the Congress with a package that are either voted up or down. Each House of Congress still has to approve any new trade agreement, but they can't amend it. And after a lot of work, in June of 2002, the Bush administration got trade promotion authority for a 3-year period. Runs out this June, but the president has just sent up a message to the Congress. He wants to extend it for 2 more years. Widely expected that will happen. It will happen unless one or the other House of Congress votes it down by majority vote, and there are procedural reasons to think, at least in addition to substantive reasons, why that won't happen. So I think we're going to have it for 2 more years. We really have, here I am back to 3 again, a 3-legged stool in our trade policy. The big prize we got to keep our eye on is a global trade agreement in what's now called the World Trade Organization, WTO, used to be called the GATT. That's got 152 members. Most of the major countries in the world are in there except Russia, Vietnam, Saudi Arabia, Ukraine, Algeria, but China is in there. And this is, if you could get a trade agreement that everybody had the same rules, the technicalities were the same, how you determine if this plastic glass is produced in, what content it had to have to be considered an American product versus a Canadian product where maybe the plastic came from or something, all of that. We are hopefully more than halfway through that process. We launched an agreement, a negotiation called the Doha Development Agenda, Doha Trade Round in Doha, the capital of Qatar, in late 2001. So we're 3.5 years into it. The last global trade round, which was a lot less complicated, had fewer members, didn't have China or Taiwan in it, or a lot of other countries. Took about 10 years, the so-called Uruguay round. So this is not going to be easy, but we've got to keep working on it, and I think we will see it through. We're trying to negotiate agricultural products, very sensitive. Every country has great sensitivities, economic, cultural identity associated with agricultural products and traditions and so on. Industrial products, very important. And services. Again, I think of our domestic economy, something like 60 or 65% are now services. And these are, in fact, often the most protected markets overseas. Our insurance companies, consultants, architects, travel agents, and so on, where we have some really very competitive companies and technologies, are locked out of a lot of these markets. So this is really important to us, and we're going to work at it. But we're not putting all our eggs in that basket, because that could take a while. We also have a regional leg in this trade package where we're working mainly in the Western Hemisphere group, the so-called Free Trade Area of the Americas. We've been working on this one for about 10 years. Frankly, it hasn't gone as well or as fast as we'd hoped. It's to a great extent locked up in a U.S.-Brazil difference. It's also complicated because many of the tough issues there, agricultural support programs, agricultural payments to farmers, we really are not able to negotiate and can't negotiate in just a regional context and let the Europeans and the Japanese, who are much larger subsidizers than we are, just take a free ride as we sort of unilaterally disarm. So how we mesh our global and our regional trade things is a challenge, and one that we are working on. This one is on a slower path. May well be that these two agreements end up, the global and the regional one, concluding about the same time, but one may move faster than the other. We'll have to see. The final area, and the one that gets the most attention, I think, is what we call the bilateral trade agenda. For many years, the U.S. resisted this. When our European friends were going off and doing trade agreements with all of their former colonies around the world, we sort of said, well, wait, this kind of detracts from this global system based in the GATT. Really shouldn't do this. We didn't make much progress. They just kept right on going. So finally, we decided we had to join this. So we started in, I think, '83. The U.S.-Israel Free Trade Agreement was our first. At that point, the Europeans probably had about 40 bilateral agreements. They're now up in the 70 range. Then we did the U.S.-Canada Agreement. Later in the 80s, and then in the early 90s concluded the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, which basically brought Mexico into the U.S.-Canada Agreement. Then, as I say, the Clinton administration sort of lost the ability legally to go off and do these things, so we went into a hiatus. At the end of the Clinton administration, they started in a negotiation with Jordan, key partner in the Middle East and very closely aligned with the Israeli economy and so on. That was one that the Bush administration inherited. We finished it up, got it approved by the Congress. We went off and negotiated Singapore and Chile free trade agreements, which have been approved by the Congress and are coming into effect. We did a U.S.-Australia free trade agreement. We did a U.S.-Morocco free trade agreement. Those have both been approved. There are two major agreements that are pending debate and approval in the U.S. Congress. The main one, and the one you're starting to see discussed in the newspapers, is the Central America and Dominican Republic Agreement. The CAFTA may be unfortunate that it rhymes with NAFTA. We think it's a much more improved kind of agreement. Not that NAFTA hasn't been good, but we think we've learned some ways to deal better with it. This is going to be coming up from the front burner. It's going to be all over the kitchen because the Congress is going to start holding hearings on it. And this is the one that the opponents of free trade, which includes some particular U.S. industries that are threatened, some in the U.S. labor and non-government organization movement, are really focusing on this. The votes in the Congress on these other free trade agreements that we've done have really not been contentious and have gone through quite smoothly. But I think the CAFTA is really going to be a battle, and we will have a debate about the merits. It may have some similarities to the NAFTA debate that some of you may remember. And it's a very complex agreement. We think it's good trade policy. We think it's good foreign policy. We think these are, 20 years ago, Central America, frankly, was a mess. We were spending billions of dollars trying to bring stability and deal with that. Now we have democracies down there. They're not perfect in terms of labor and some of the other issues, but we think the Central American Free Trade Agreement can be a tool for us. It can deal with help deal with creating economies down there that'll help deal with some of the illegal immigration issues that we're feeling up here, and also some of the illegal narcotics that pass through Central America, if we can make those economies have other kinds of opportunities. We also have the U.S.-Bahrain agreement that's also waiting approval after we have this big battle that we will have on the CAFTA. We're also going out, we have an agenda. We're far along in a negotiation with Panama. That doesn't fit with the rest of Central America for it's a different kind of economy, more services-based, banking and so on. We also are negotiating with 3 Andean countries, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. We have just launched negotiations with the United Arab Emirates and with Oman. I think the Middle East is a particular priority. The President has laid out a Middle East free trade area idea that by building these individual agreements over the next 5, 10 years, then we'll be able to knit them together into a regional agreement, which obviously the Middle East is an area that has many political problems. It also has a lot of economic problems. It's not integrated into the world economy, and we think we have an economic and a political interest to try to facilitate that. So that's out there, and an agreement with Thailand, which may not be on the map of a lot of Americans, but it's a huge country of 80 or 90 million people. It's a rapidly growing economy. They have a vital automobile industry, which raises some tough issues for us. This is a huge market if we can work out a trade agreement that opens up that market to our goods and services. Now, the rest of the world isn't standing still. China's out there, Japan is out there, Europe's out there, and if they can go out and negotiate agreements that open those markets to their products, and we don't, our companies are going to have a comparative disadvantage. So it isn't just black and white, is this good or not? Is it how do we fit this into a global sort of strategy? Sorry, I've sort of gone on longer than I had intended. Why don't I stop there? I'd be glad to take questions or comments or dissenting views on any of the topics that I raised. The comment related to HIV/AIDS and cited when the Ukrainian ambassador had come here and talked about how serious the problem was in their country, and obviously it is in Africa and other places. And the lady makes the point about, as you open economies and facilitate interaction, is there not a risk that you're facilitating the spread of this terrible virus? Yeah, I think you are. I mean, I'm not an expert on HIV/AIDS. It's a terrible thing. We're struggling. The U.S. is far and away the leading donor, to the international effort, to the International Fund for AIDS, to our bilateral programs. But even with all the money that's being put forward, the problem is a very serious one. I personally believe that I would not agree with something that said, well, and as part of fighting this AIDS thing, we're going to close off, the borders and not facilitate movement of people or goods or something. I think we ought to be smart enough and organized enough and dedicated enough to figure out a way that we wouldn't have to sacrifice the trade and economic benefits that come from having an open economy, and also be smarter about dealing with the AIDS crisis. I'm not an expert in saying how you do that, but I would really hesitate to think that one of the ways you would do it, because how far down do you do it? Do you allow truck drivers within Ukraine? I mean, that's been cited as one of the sources through which HIV/AIDS was spread so widely in Africa, and a lot of it is within an individual country. And I think you just have to accept that we're in a global economy and then try to figure out what's an AIDS strategy that works there. The question, I think, was just picking up on the same theme, that the problem in many of these countries that are heavily affected by HIV/AIDS is that it's the people in the productive years of life who are hit most heavily. And experts, I think, call this the sort of hollowing out, that in some countries in Africa you have a lot of older people and a lot of kids, and the people who would be, running the families and also the main producers in the economy are being most heavily hit by that disease. So yeah, I think that's, and there are some things that can be done. We think I mean, we give a State Department award every year, two actually, one to a major Fortune 500 company, one to a small or medium-sized U.S. company that do really good sort of community, social responsibility kinds of things overseas. And the Secretary of State gives it. 2 years ago, I think Ford of South Africa got the award for some really incredible things they were doing in the workplace, dealing with their employees and customers and so on, and franchise dealers and so on who were dealing with the disease and stuff. I mean, I think the business community can be part of a solution, not the whole solution. I mean, ultimately, I think research and technology are going to have to find the solution. Yes, sir. The question was whether I could give some examples of, both on the positive and negative side, of outsourcing. This is a much debated issue, which means sort of jobs going overseas. Look, the issue of jobs is really a critical one, and I know it's often asserted that free trade causes job loss. I think that's a gross oversimplification and so on. Outsourcing has come to me, I mean, as I believe, has come to believe to relate more to the services area, which is to say, I mean, one example would be an American company here that does computer software or back office work for a bank or insurance company. Instead of hiring Americans to do the work here, they subcontract to a company in India or China to do it at lower cost and so on like this, and it can cause unemployment here. This is one of the reasons we want to get some more international rules about what is fair competition in services and so on. But I think some of the discussion of this gets overly emotional. The U.S. there's much more insourcing into the U.S. If we were to decide that outsourcing was bad, we would be a net loser for all the outsourcing that goes. And it tends to be the lower skill jobs and lower paid jobs. It's basic computer programming, it's transcription, it's tech support for basic electronics kinds of things. So far, potential it could go into other kinds of things. But there's an awful lot of insourcing that's coming in from Europe, from Asia, of people that want to do their research here because of various things about the U.S. economy that are coming here to get their computer programming done because they can't get it done efficiently in Europe and so on like this. So I think to portray that outsourcing is just a huge threat to the U.S. economy is only part of the problem. It's a complex issue. People smarter than me have to really do some analysis of it and so on like this. The other thing, for example, I mean, just to give you one thing, say this computer software company here but outsources to India to get some of its basic computer work done there more cost. That may make them more competitive. They can go out and win a contract than in Japan or China or Europe or something, which ends up with more jobs here at the higher levels. I don't really know where these things net out, but I am smart enough to have a sense that it's a pretty complex issue. And it's not unlike what's gone on in a lot of industrial things over the last decades. I mean, people have been companies have driven to be more competitive, have sought lower cost places of production, and that forces an adjustment in the economy, which can be painful, but it also keeps the economy vibrant and dynamic. But it only works, if you have a system of support for workers who lose their jobs, retraining, and all of those kinds of things. You've got to have safety nets built into this, the so-called trade adjustment assistance and so on. The gentleman's question relates to, and I'm not an expert in this, but it relates to the question of visas, particularly for summer employees to come from abroad to work. He cited the case of the seafood and crab industry around in Maryland, and also the camp issue and so on like this. And I mean, this is total candor. The issue of visas and who gets into and out of this country changed on September 11th of 2001. I mean, some people think you would like to see it made more. There are other industries who would like to see, or labor organizations who feel that we're letting too many people in. But I respect your opinion. I'll take it back to the people who do it. It's technically not the State Department. We issue the visas and stuff overseas. It's what used to be the old Immigration and Naturalization Service makes policy decisions and so on. They're now part of Homeland Security. We're part of the administration. We implement the policies and so on, and we're the people who do the visas. But I just say that on this issue, I've heard people espouse your position, and I've heard people espouse the contrary, that we're letting too many of these temporary seasonal workers, they come in and we aren't sure where they're all from, and either for security reasons or to save jobs for Americans. These issues of immigration get very, very complex, but I respect your opinion, and I know it's out there. The gentleman made a comment that the debate about trade and job loss and competition is the mirror image exists in other countries where the same debate is taking place, and it's based on the principle of comparative advantage, where factors, workers, and capital migrate to where things can be produced more efficiently, and it's based on economics. But that was just an introductory comment. His question started out with another comment that he thought the State Department was the tail being wagged by the Treasury Department dog, I think, in particularly relate to currency, and particularly relating to China and the value of the Chinese currency vis-a-vis the U.S. dollar. I mean, I think is that, and when were we going to wake up?
The Treasury Department is allowing us to have a huge fiscal deficit. This is going to result in a huge trade deficit.
Yeah.
It will have to be financed.
And related to the so-called twin deficits, the fiscal deficit we're having as a government and the trade deficit we're having as a nation. Look, the Treasury Department is in the lead, so if we're the tail on their dog, I mean, we are part of the administration. The Treasury Department does lead on all kinds of financial and value of the dollar kinds of things. Secretary Snow has been very clear, speaking for the administration, that we believe it's in the interest, first of all, of China and of the world economy and of the United States, that China move to a more market-determined rate of exchange. They've effectively linked their currency, the yuan, to the U.S. dollar. And so a lot of the economics we all studied in college about countries running surpluses, and therefore that stimulates adjustments, don't work because the currency rates don't change. I am really not the expert. It is the Treasury Department dog. You need to get up here to answer that. The only thing I would say is there is a very active discussion, dialogue. Much of it is in private, not in public, with the Chinese about this problem. And I think there is a recognition of this problem. How to do it, public pressure, private pressure, persuasion, threats, how best to change to deal with China. We can have a debate, and there are proposals in the Congress to slap tariffs on goods from China to compensate. Other people have different ideas. It's a challenge dealing with China. They are a huge new factor in the global economy, and the exchange rate, I think, is part of that. But you got to get a Treasury Department dog up here to really debate you on that. The question related to corruption and my comment earlier about what we were doing. How big a problem is it for American companies abroad? What's the State Department really doing, as opposed to just a little bit of arm twisting, I think was the essence of the question. I don't think we can really know. Almost by definition, corruption is the most covert and underground of any of these kinds of issues. And sorting out what really is or isn't happening. What I do have a sense, 5 years ago, I believe it was, 7 years ago, certainly, the only country that had anti-corruption laws outside of its own, in other words, that applied to people from that country as they acted abroad internationally, was the U.S. through this Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which I think came from the 70s and after related to some of the scandals that we had back then. Now we have an OECD, this group of the 30 industrial countries. We have reached a basic agreement. They can't be tax deducted. There is an annual review process, self-review, where countries get and quiz and probe and ask people, why haven't you prosecuted this? What's going on with that? It's a little bit of a spotlight being shown on it. We've gotten a UN Convention on Corruption that, frankly, it was concluded about a year ago. The U.S. has not yet ratified it. We're trying to get that through the Senate, and we're pushing others to do it. And then just, it made us be jawboning or arm twisting, but every one of our ambassadors and their commercial attaches and their staff in the embassies overseas, are looking for this issue. And it isn't just an American company, coming in and saying, I lost this case because this Japanese company I competed with, they must have bribed somebody. It's the only way I could have lost. I mean, you've got to have real information, and it's hard to get the information. But I think when the American ambassador goes into a president or a finance minister or a commerce minister or the chairman of a national airline in a foreign country and raises this issue and pushes and asks questions and so on, we're making progress. If people have specific ideas or of how we can do more of it, we're looking for this. This is it's a very tough issue, but our companies have in general lived up to very high standards, and we don't want to see them losing contracts because a foreign competitor can go in there and do it. And we're working on it. Yes, sir. Well, let me say, we're trying to repeat the question. The gentleman said he also wanted to talk about the corruption, but more from the homegrown U.S. side. He cited that he had worked in the 60s at AT&T, where labs where there was effectively a monopoly in the phone service industry. Now it's been broken up, and we've got a lot of companies in competition. And he had the sense that there was, a lot of corruption there, but you could get business deals done based on that. And what did I think of it? And what I'm going to say is, I don't really do domestic. I mean, I as a citizen have my own views. You've expressed your views. I'm not in charge of incorporating, of dealing with that. I mean, the only thing I will say, there is a link between our credibility as we go around the world preaching open economy, preaching fighting corruption and so on, with how our system works and how transparent we are. And if we have scandals in the United States, nobody's perfect, but if we have them, that frankly affects our credibility overseas. And we are a more open society. Do we have more scandals than some of our other industrial countries that we're often compared to? If so, is that because we have more corruption or because we have a more vigorous press and a more open society than a lot of other countries? I don't know. It's a whole nother issue. It's not really in my area.
I apologize for having to call the evening session to an end. This has been thoroughly enjoyable, and we appreciate very, very much you sharing your time with us.
Thank you.